great architecture has been described as the magnificent display of forms brought together in light. This is clearly a prestige building, an artwork of high status. Built as a monument of British wealth and power, it was put up in the late 19th century in Bombay as the Victoria Terminus, a centerpiece of the railway network that the British contributed to India. Its modern name is Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus, or CST, after a 17th century Indian warrior. But to most of the millions who use it, it remains Victoria Terminus, or VT. The rail network established by the British provides a widespread and thoroughly effective means of transport. It's a contrast to the traditional methods of bullock cart and camel. But this is the transport of the age of industrialization that was in full swing when Victoria Terminus was built. And the sumptuousness of that headquarters building of the great Indian Peninsula Railway is a tribute to the vision and confidence of those who built it. It's a splendid example of the Gothic Revival style that was popular in Britain in the middle of the 19th century. Yet Victoria Terminus is a building that does not feature in the canonical histories of the Gothic Revival or of Western architecture. One reason is that this building is in Bombay, in India. It belongs to the distant empire rather than the cultural centre of the West. But it is a monument of the British Raj, and so it's as much British as it is Indian. I want to explore the way it stands at a meeting point of cultures. What happens when two cultures collide? What meanings does such a building have, and for who?
Hello.
It's a building introduced into another culture as an expression of imperial power. But we need to consider whether it can only be judged by Western standards. We can trace both Western and Indian elements in this building, and an important part of its meaning lies in its context. VT was not the first Gothic building to be erected in Bombay. The style was already established for major public buildings. Sir Bartle Frere, governor of Bombay, deliberately chose the style as a statement of up-to-date modernity in an attempt to make Bombay urbs prima in Indis, the first city of India. He commissioned Sir George Gilbert Scott, the most eminent exponent of the style in Britain, to design a university with tower, library and convocation hall. Frere and Scott thus gave a high status to higher education in the Western style, which, like modern transport, was another contribution of the British Raj. Scott was inspired by a variety of European medieval sources. The open loggias and windows of Venetian Gothic were particularly suited to the hot climate. And Scott based his Rajabai Tower on Giotto's campanile for Florence Cathedral. This is still a landmark in Bombay. It's part of a series of monumental Gothic public buildings that reflected the growing wealth and status of the city. Erected along the original shoreline, they would have been the first buildings to be seen by the mainly British travellers arriving by sea. Now, after decades of land reclamation, these buildings are in the centre of the city. VT, the last of this series, was built as the headquarters of the Great Indian Peninsula Railway, or GIPR, the first company in India to run passenger trains. The service ran just 35 miles from Bombay to Thane.
The railways were a wonder when they were first started, and eyewitness accounts of the first day describes how people poured into the city from outside the city and sat on, balconies of all the houses along the track to gape at this new monster puffing away slowly towards Thana. I think one could see VT definitely as a celebration of the success of the commercial operation and the engineering feat that was required to throw the railway across from Bombay to the mainland, across the Western Ghats, and eventually down south across the Deccan and north towards Agra and Delhi.
So this Gothic palace served as a celebration of the new development of rail travel and an advertisement for the GIPR and for British rule. The figure of progress that caps the dome epitomizes the confidence of the community that commissioned the building. But F.W. Stevens, the architect, drew on other Gothic buildings.
Train about to depart from platform 9 and 9:55 to Leeds. This train conveys
We know that he returned to Britain on leave shortly before designing VT, and he will almost certainly have made a point of visiting the newly completed Midland Grand Hotel and Terminus. This was intended to provide for a newly rich middle-class clientele, and above all, to advertise a fine and profitable company. To get a feel for the purpose of this architecture, for the function of its rich ornamentation, you've got to make a conscious effort of the imagination. Forget the traffic, forget the present. This is a 19th century railway hotel. Just think of stepping down from your carriage under this arcaded porte-cochere. Gracious steps make a processional route up to the hotel doorway, which leads straight into a spacious lobby that really is designed to express the status of the rising middle-class clientele. Sir George Gilbert Scott, the architect of this hotel, felt like Freer that Gothic was the appropriate style, a national British style. And Gothic, with its tradition of carved ornament and colour, suited the Victorian taste for rich decoration. Both the details and the shapes were based on the great buildings of the Middle Ages. Scott's vaulted ceiling reminds us of his restoration of Salisbury Cathedral only 5 years earlier. And his design for St Pancras probably owes much to his work at Salisbury. Salisbury was often regarded as a paradigm of medieval Gothic architecture. The soaring pillars and vaulted ceiling were designed to lift the souls of the worshippers and instill a sense of wonder at God's great house. The inventiveness of design and skill of the masons is evident, and it's easy to see how Britain could draw upon this past of glorious buildings to feed a 19th century national pride. The shapes of buildings such as Salisbury Cathedral, it was hoped, could be used to create a similar inspirational effect in structures for the modern world. set the two side by side, and features from Salisbury can be recognised in St Pancras. But medieval Gothic had to be adapted for use in the steam age. Instead of soaring lancet windows, there are rows and rows of identical openings to light the 150 hotel bedrooms. And square sash frames are fitted in by simply sliding them up behind the Gothic arches. An arch of cathedral proportions leads through to the station, whose iron roof was, in its time, the largest span in the world. This platform space, an essential part of the ensemble, is impressive as engineering alone. But the iron structure has been carefully ornamented in a way that is typical of Victorian architecture and accords with the hotel. The booking hall, too, is decorated with a series of corbels in the medieval tradition that illustrate the 19th century activities of running a railway. All this is typical of its time and is a display of elaborate and expensive craftsmanship. The drama of travel and of a luxury hotel is part of the meaning of this artwork. The whole thing adds up to a cathedral of the age of steam. How far did it rely on medieval precedents? This isn't a Gothic staircase at all, but very much of the 19th century. The steps are cantilevered out from the wall in a way that was rarely done in the Middle Ages. And the landings are supported on great iron beams, and that was a modern material in the 19th century. But this rich mixture of ornament, flowing space, and airy steps created such an exciting experience that it was worth exporting straight to Bombay. At Victoria Terminus, a vaulted dome covers the staircase hall with a richly carved gallery beneath it, and the cantilevered steps themselves spiral the whole way down to the ground floor. They're enriched with a balustrade of wrought iron, used here for its decorative potential. And that use of wrought iron for decoration had been common in the Middle Ages. But here at Victoria Terminus, we have to remember that the building is a 19th century one, designed by a Briton, but built in India by Indian craftsmen. Superficially, VT may seem similar to St Pancras. But there are important differences. The train shed is to one side, and the showpiece structure houses not a hotel, but offices. The Great Stair was not to impress and delight guests, but for railway staff. They were the highest-ranking staff of the company, and the real justification for the Great Stairway was display. And there's much else about the building that's for display, such as the lofty dome with its stained glass windows, where the elephant stands for India and luxury travel. Stained glass is foreign to Indian art and asserts the European roots of this building. It was a medieval medium that was reinvented as an essential part of the Gothic Revival. Here, it helps to provide a decorative and diffused illumination in the harsh Indian light. There is a direct link back to the glass inserted in the old windows of Salisbury by Scott. And the decorated vaults at Salisbury that Scott adapted for St Pancras are evoked by Stevens in the booking hall at VT. This display was meant to impress the natives as well as fellow Englishmen. For the natives, it was a demonstration of British imperial power and supremacy. For the visitor from England, it was a way of showing that the expatriate British community understood the nature of the revived Gothic style and could build as impressively as anyone back home. Although this is an Indian version, its shapes relate to Western Gothic from a variety of periods and places. The windows of both St Pancras and VT owe as much to Venetian Gothic as to English medieval precedents. That was the nature of the Gothic Revival. The Victorians were not afraid to draw on a multitude of sources. But in India, they had to modify them to take account of the climate. A deep corridor runs right round the building, protecting the offices from excessive heat and monsoon rains.
The architecture used at VT certainly had to be functional, otherwise the client wouldn't have paid for it. I think that's the most important aspect to to be sensitized to when one looks at VT.
The building, with its huge train shed, still caters for the masses who pour in for work every day. But it was built as a commercial palace, advertising its presence in Bombay. And the architect used local stones. The yellow walls are of a sandstone called malat. And there are coloured stones brought in by rail, as was the fine limestone from Porbandar.
All the Bombay buildings have the ornamentation done in that because it's softer, easier to carve and to chisel. So majority of Bombay building has this combination of the local malat sandstone, which is the yellow buff color stone, and the Porbandar stone, which is the limestone.
Well, perhaps you could look at some of these stones in detail then.
Sure, there are all kinds of stones which are here, like this stone. This is basalt, the local basalt, and this is hand chisel, which you can easily make out from the chisel marks which are seen here.
That's these horizontal markings.
That's true. And this band continues of the basalt band continues here, which acts as a relief. And this is the local malat trap stone.
The yellow is the sandstone.
That's right.
Right. And this, I think I'm more familiar with. This is Scottish granite, isn't it?
That's right.
Polished on a steam lathe and shipped out ready-made.
Yes. And on top you have the Porbandar stone cornices. And they've been extensively carved. You have the foliage, you have the leaf motifs, and you have the animals. And that's it, limestone, the Porbandar stone which I was talking about.
And that gives the wonderful richness to the whole building.
That's right.
The carvings on Victoria Terminus are particularly interesting. Some of the iconography is exactly what one would expect of a Victorian public building. VT also has a range of animal sculpture rich enough for a natural history museum. And among them is the British lion and the exotic peacock, symbolizing India. It's the richness of flora and fauna on VT that is breathtaking, and to my Western eyes is one of the things that bears the mark of an Indian tradition of craftsmanship. Though these vigorous animal spouts that throw off rainwater are medieval in origin, in the hands of Indian sculptors, they take on a different character.
I think one could say that VT is to the British Empire what the Taj Mahal would be to the Mughal Empire, in that it's an extraordinary combination of the architectural style of Britain at the time, the engineering prowess coming together, and the teaching methods that the British were popularizing in India at the time through the JJ School of Art. The JJ School of Art was founded by Jansi Jijiboi to marry Western ideas about art with a native Indian perceptions of art and craft. The result of that was a team of trained people to be able to carve public works projects and buildings of the type of VT. And all of the capitals and all the columns were all carved on site in VT. They weren't brought from workshops somewhere else. And that's an interesting working practice because it's exactly what was done within India traditionally, going back to, you know, the 8th century, the 2nd century, or whatever period you wish to examine.
For the mainly Hindu masons working at VT, the carving was probably as much an act of religious worship as it was of decorating a secular building, simply because their tradition stretched back to temples such as this, where the snake god, Seshnag, is being evoked by Arjuna. Praying in the forest, Arjuna is surrounded by animals in this relief carving at Mahabalipuram in South India, dating from the mid-7th century. The vigour and naturalism of some of these animal carvings suggests to me that the masons were working from direct experience, and there was never any shortage of that.
I think if you'd been living in India at the time, you would have been in a tropical country which has great richness in flora and fauna. What we see on CST are the local fauna, wonderfully exemplified in stone carving, plus quite bizarre, fanciful versions of the same.
Unlike VT, Indian building made no distinction between an architect and builders, and no drawings were involved. Native craftsmen planned, designed and built together. There was no authorship, and only the patron was remembered. The Indian tradition involves complex aesthetics, which are very different from the Western. Hindu thinking doesn't differentiate structure from decoration. Both are equally important. Though in the West, it had often been felt that the act of designing required intellect, whereas decoration was a subsidiary skill. Structures like this house in Ahmedabad show that Indian builders didn't think along those lines. Here, decoration is the principal element, the raison d'être. All this had to change. The British were happy to use Indian masons and sculptors, but their skills had to be harnessed to the Gothic cause.
Indians who had carved marvelously for 2,000 years before the British came learned Western techniques and carried on with their stone carving traditions, whereas other Indians were then pushed out of urban projects and remained only for Hindu temples or for smaller constructions within villages and this sort of thing.
These temples are at Banganga, a holy place on the outskirts of Bombay, barely 3 miles from VT. Several of these temples were rebuilt in the 1890s, and they continue the Hindu tradition of decorative and animal carving by sculptor-designers. This carving is noticeably less correct, less tightly controlled than that at VT. It's also possible that some of the patterns they used were in turn inspired by the work of friends or distant cousins at VT. The Gothic revival of VT is certainly rich, perhaps too rich to satisfy a Western critic. There's been a long tendency among Western critics to see elaboration as a sign of decadence, and the very richness of VT might be thought of as an element of its Indianness. In spite of British training and control, the vibrancy and vigour of Indian sculpting has crept in, and much of the inspiration is from Indian natural forms. This leaf shape is repeated on a larger scale in these OG arches, which in India are known as peepal arches, after the sacred peepal tree, which has leaves of a similar shape. The Victorian delight in rich ornamentation found an echo in the Indian passion for detailed decoration. This parallel interest allowed a cultural flow in both directions. The peacock, a common Hindu motif, reappears at St. Pancras, just like the flower vase that's typical of Mughal design. In this, Scott may owe something to Owen Jones's Grammar of Ornament, published in 1856. This book, widely used by British architects and designers, set out to categorize patterns of ornament on a worldwide basis. Of the 100 plates, no less than 10 are of Hindu and Indian, by which Jones means Mughal, patterns. Victorian architects could easily mix formalized patterns of Indian ornament with decoration derived from other sources. Sometimes, as here at St. Pancras, there was even direct use of Indian or Islamic motifs. This wooden screen is Islamic in inspiration, the sort of work that's typical of lots of Eastern countries. In India, they're called jalis, and One of their functions is to maintain purdah. Here, the use is similar, because this is a decency screen. Without it, men on the lower floor might see the ankles of ladies on this upper landing, and that would have offended Victorian sensibilities. Pierced screens of the Islamic tradition were much used in Mughal India. Mughal rulers, who moved into India as conquerors in the 14th century, employed Hindu artisans to build their mosques. But in these Islamic structures, human and animal forms could not be represented. This is the Sidi Saeed Mosque in Ahmedabad. By the time it was built, there was already a tradition of Hindu craftsmen creating Muslim buildings and motifs for their Muslim rulers. It was a pattern of employment that was to be repeated by the British. In the jalis of this mosque is a tree of life pattern that's closely copied on a roundel at Victoria Terminus. India before the railways was a very different world. One that is almost lost. The traditional modes of travel implied their own architecture. Before trains, travel had been so much slower that there'd been a need for travellers' rest stations at regular intervals right across the subcontinent. These were the caravanserais of the Mughal period, a building type that was made redundant by the British when they swept aside the earlier rulers of India and brought their railways. The Islamic rulers of India had made it their business to provide such structures throughout their domains. The people who travelled extensively then were mainly merchants. Even today, Azam Khan's Sarai in Ahmedabad is a focus for some of their traditional functions. The building provides an imposing backdrop for the life of the traders. One of the problems for any ruler in India has been to stamp their mark on a diverse population. By providing basic facilities, rulers secured loyalty. And by putting those facilities in fine buildings, they demonstrated their power. This caravanserai at Bijapur is linked to a great tank providing that most basic facility, water. The architecture, Muslim again, is relatively simply decorated. But the arched interior provides shade from the blinding heat outside, and the open windows and arcades bring in cool breezes. The original space for horses is now used by local tongas, a popular mode of transport within the city. The railways of the British Raj were new in both scale and extent. Previous rulers had merely provided for traditional needs on a more local basis. Their structures weren't always so dominant. This is Bhai Haria's stepwell in Ahmedabad.
All over Gujarat and Rajasthan, the climate is dry. Soil is arid. Rivers are not perennial. And in the summer months, level of water goes down very deep. wells are found everywhere, of course. But some intelligent architect in Western India had this idea of opening up one side of the well and of providing access to the level of water. Hence, steps were built which lead down to the lowest level that water can sink to during the dry months. You have the well and the steps, that makes it a step well. Step well is a monument entirely underground, except for the frontal pavilion. Everything is subterranean.
So the three pavilions are all you see above ground, and I suppose this is like a prelude to the well rather than the well itself.
That's true. The real step well starts here in the first pavilion.
That's when we've got one stage done.
One stage, and where they have placed the two inscriptions, one in Sanskrit and the other in Arabic, on either side.
So why are there two languages? Why Sanskrit and Arabic?
Sanskrit is the ancient Indian language, and Arabic because the king who was ruling here was a Muslim. In a Hindu monument, for example a temple, in a niche like this, complete with pilasters and a superstructure model, you would expect the image of a god. And since this is a well, here you might expect the god of water, Varuna. But you see, this step well was built during the Muslim period, and perhaps they avoided representing divinities in human form. Hence arabesques, creepers, albeit creepers of lotus, for example, aquatic creepers, but not human representations.
So this niche, it's not just a piece of decoration.
No, it symbolizes the presence of a god.
So the alternation of light and shade as you go down is a very attractive experience. Did they design it with that in mind?
Yes, it was a conscious design on the part of the architects.
And although you get quite a long way down, there's always just enough light to see.
And it's cooler too.
Much cooler. And we're almost down, one more double flight.
And we come to the tank or reservoir.
Yes. I haven't counted the number of steps, but I suppose that if you were carrying water up, you would know exactly how many.
Yes.
So when at last you finally get down to the darkest, coolest part, this is where people would actually draw water here in the tank. And then you look up, and it's like the climax to the whole thing. It's so rich.
Yes, they had vast resources of ornamental motifs at their disposal. Pillars, pilasters, architraves, lintels, medallions, and they have employed them all here in this monument.
And it appears to be largely geometric ornament. You say this was Muslim or Hindu ornament?
It was a Muslim monument, but the ornament was Hindu, because the masons, the artisans were all Hindus.
These vast resources of ornament are the sort of thing that had impressed Owen Jones. And we can see similar ornament at VT. But it's not quite the same. One reason is that the Mughal rulers were more closely integrated into Indian life. They made India their homeland, where the British were always an expatriate community. When we consider Victoria Terminus in the light of the way the caravanserais were steadily replaced by the station as the structure of transportation, we may find it has a different sort of meaning. Largely developed after 1858, the rail network was useful to the British for transporting troops, but there was more to it than that.
I would say that the British built the railway system in India specifically for their own needs and requirement. First, was to keep their logistics for their troops open, to move into the hinterland. And that is why you had the first railway lines coming in on the coastal towns, because all the inputs were by sea, and all men material movements were by sea. Men and material would land at the seaports and then move into the hinterland, right to the east coast and right to the north frontier provinces. And second is that they used the same railway lines for bringing in the produce from the hinterland. And basically at that time it used to be cotton or industrial goods or spices for export out of the seaports to Europe. So it was for a cross-section of political, military and economic reasons.
But the services the British introduced were used by Indians and had their effect on Indian society. The freedom of rail travel was a factor in the spread of Indian national consciousness, a key political current that coincided with the completion of VT. Sensitivity to this led to a change in architectural style, and Stephen's next commission, the municipal buildings, adds Indian domes to a Gothic structure.
Indo-Saracenic style represents a kind of national style for India itself, whereas the High Victorian Gothic style was the national style of the British who came to India, and therefore with the growth of Indian nationalism in the 1880s and 90s, and also an interest in the craft tradition coming out of an arts and crafts movement within India, within Britain itself, you then get a real interest in an analysis of Indian buildings, and one of those results is the Indo-Saracenic style of architecture, which still is essentially a British style of architecture in that it doesn't look like Indian or Mughal buildings, particularly, and partly because of the scale and the function of the buildings that are being used with this style, but rather it's clothed in an Indo-Saracenic garb as opposed to a High Victorian Gothic one.
Although Stephens took note of this change of mood, it was his rival, R.F. Chisholm, who really developed the new style. And there's a link with the railways here too. Increased mobility meant that scholars and architects could travel more rapidly and go further to see the buildings on which they would base their Indo-Saracenic style. Chisholm, for instance, built in Madras and was to build in Baroda, and he almost certainly visited Bijapur to see the great Gol Gumbaz. This had been described as remarkable for simple grandeur and constructive boldness. I think this combination of simple geometry with complex and daring construction is exactly the kind of thing to appeal to architects like Chisholm. The plan is a circle within a square. The building almost exactly a cube capped by a hemisphere. But that simplicity totally fails to convey the magnificence of one of the largest domes in the world. Almost 40 meters in diameter, it's a good bit larger than St. Paul's in London. And it encloses one vast square space, the largest uninterrupted space in the world capped by a single dome. It's the personal mausoleum of the ruler of just one small Muslim kingdom. And here again, Hindu craftsmen produced an architecture of mixed motifs. Hindu brackets, pattern in the Persian tradition, and Mughal domes. Inspired by this marriage of cultures, Chisholm at Baroda deliberately set out to draw on both traditions. The Faculty of Arts building at Baroda University repeats shapes from a variety of Indian sources. The decoration replicates Hindu religious images, in this case the elephant deity Ganesh, and conventional Islamic motifs. Ultimately, the form and function are those of a 19th century public building from the era of the British Raj. The building remains as much a foreign hybrid as VT. And this isn't because religious imagery is inappropriate or Hindu and Mughal motifs cannot be combined. Rather, it's because the mechanical copying by a stonemason from someone else's drawing loses some of the vigour that's so evident in work of the continuing Hindu tradition. This facade shows the delight in rich ornament and sense of the decorative that had so impressed Western critics as essential to the Indian artistic tradition. Yet this house is roughly contemporary with VT, so the tradition was still alive when that was built. The best masons from this tradition were trained for working at VT, and it's the rich ornament that gives it its distinctive character. But the overall form and function are those of the British Raj. The station served that empire and all its people, Hindu, Muslim and expatriate British. Today, the British Raj has gone, but the building remains as its imprint. It is the jewel in the crown of Bombay architecture.
The station handles 1,140 suburban trains, bringing over 1 million passengers into this great station on a daily basis. Running 34 long-distance trains, terminating 34 long-distance trains, and it's absolutely a very functional station building at the same time as being an excellent specimen of art and architecture.
चुक चुक चक चक बॉम्बे से बड़ौदा तक